a song for ya.
You're listening to Deep Purple Smoke on the Podcast. I will do one episode for each song the band recorded in the studio. However, this is a fan podcast and not band endorsed. It's more of a tribute to their long history, well beyond just the hits, and my way of giving something back to a band that has given so much to me. Let's dig in! Hello and welcome to another episode of Deep Purple Smoke on the Podcast. I am your host, Scott Haskin, and I realized something yesterday after I was done recording the last episode. I had forgotten that I had intended to drop a handful of episodes on the first day of the podcast. So you're going to get this episode, as you can see in your player, today, as well as one more episode after this. I think I've said in a couple of episodes referring to yesterday's episode or Monday's episode, and I forgot they're all coming out the same day. Normally, they'll be Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. So anyway, as I'm continuing to develop the show and change and make little adjustments here and there, those things will happen. But I'm really excited to just kind of come out of the gate with a bunch of stuff for you to listen to, and then just be on the normal schedule after that. Hopefully you guys are enjoying these episodes so far. The one with Corey, a little bit longer than most of the episodes will be. The last, see, I almost said it again, yesterday's episode, because I recorded it yesterday in my real time. The last episode, very short because it was a very short song. This one, I could have done these together, but I think each one kind of deserves its own attention. And I've seen versions where they're put together as one song. I've seen versions where they're separated as two separate tracks. So today we're just going to do the Prelude Happiness part of Prelude Happiness / I'm So Glad. And then in the next episode, again, I said it today. In the next episode, we'll do I'm So Glad. And then starting tomorrow, we'll be on our one episode per day schedule. So there it is. If I have everything right, the logos are up. People are loving the new logos for the show. Scott Ledzinski did such an amazing job on these logos. He did the logos for the Magicians podcast as well. And, going to high school was where I met Scott at the very end of my sophomore year when we moved from Michigan to Colorado. He was one of the first people that I met. We just became friends right away, which is not surprising for creatives to gravitate towards each other in our school, which was a little more, I want to say it was a little more centered around academics than my school in Michigan was, and like college prep type. And sports, there was a lot of sports going on at that school. So it was a very different environment for me. And Scott and I just right off the bat clicked and became good friends. We've been good friends since. He's got an incredible book series that he's in the process of putting out. The first one's out. He's working on getting the second one out. And I've been a beta reader on that series. And it's fantasy, which is not normally my genre at all. But I'm really enjoying it. Very deep and intense characters. Whether you love them or you hate them, you want to know what happens to them. And intense action sequences, beautiful landscapes. I mean, it's got everything. And it's really incredible. So yeah, Scott's a great guy, and I'm so grateful he was able to find the time, especially around the holidays, to make these amazing logos for me. And just on the Facebook posts, people have been commenting on how much they love it. So well done, Scott. Thank you so much. Okay, let's get to today's song. So we are, of course, still on Shades of Deep Purple here in season 1. Every album will be its own season. I mean, the seasons really don't matter, but it just helps me keep track of things as far as the spreadsheet. And, when I upload them, it's easier to just have it this way. So if somebody just wants a certain album, they can just go right to that season. Everything's linked there together. And that's how I have it on the website. Depending on where you guys are listening, if you should have the podcast in your feed. If for some reason you don't, or an episode doesn't show up for some reason, I don't control that. The distributor that I use, Acast, they control all of that. But sometimes little glitches happen. I know the Deep Purple podcast lost a bunch of episodes on their Apple podcast feed. And then, but I can find them on other podcast feeds, and they're there just fine. So, I don't know what episode is going where, showing up where. But if you're missing an episode, you can always go to the website, scotthaskin.com. There's a list for all my podcasts. Go to there. The Deep Purple podcast is listed. And then every album will be listed on the main page. Then from there, you can click on that album. It'll take you to the album page, and then the player for each episode should be there. And I'll add those as the episodes get released because I don't get the code until it goes live. So it'll take a few minutes for me to put that in the website and update it, but it should be fairly quick. So that is how that's going to work. So if you're missing an episode, if one doesn't show up on one of the normal scheduled days, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, just go to the website and you can listen to it right through there. You can stream it. Yeah, so that's that. So let's get to our song. This is Prelude Happiness by Deep Purple. Of course, we start out with our typical sound effect for this album. Again, so far, every song except for And the Address has had a sound effect to open up the track. I don't know how they decided to, like, they're just like, hey, here's a cool effect, let's put it on this song. Or if they were like, okay, we have this song, here's the kind of effect we're looking for. I'm guessing it's the former. I mean, obviously, One More Rainy Day, the thunderstorm, that just makes sense. But everything else is just kind of they're just sounds that aren't necessarily related to anything. It's not a particular happy sound. It's not a particular sad sound. There's really not much to it. It's just kind of interesting and more sci-fi than anything else. So don't know what the decisions were that went into that, but that is how the song opens. That's what we get. And from there, goes into some really nice keyboard work. I love the sound. I love just the tones, the gentleness. It's not overplayed. It's just kind of setting a mood. And then we're about to get this song, I'm telling you, is just a masterclass in snare work. And we're hearing a little bit of it here at the beginning. I love, even though it sounds really dry, there's something I really love about the snare sound on this album. And maybe it's just because I'm used to it. And you'll hear me say that a lot because it's very possible. I have to be open to that. But it just sounds so defined and easy to hear and understand. I don't think it detracts. I think it's well mixed. The bass drum is really where I have my issues more on this album than the snare. The toms also sound interesting. There's something about 60s toms that just have an overtone to them. It's kind of like it's all decay and you miss the attack, but you hear the tone of it. It's really, really weird how a lot of drummers sounded back at this time. And then you get a guy like Carl Palmer who comes along and man, you hear everything. Just everything cuts through. But he was a pretty heavy hitter too. Ian Pace was not a heavy hitter. He was more of a technique guy. And I remember him talking about Carmine Appice and how I guess their drums, they opened for Carmine's band. And I guess Carmine's drums didn't show up and he used Ian's kit and just beat the hell out of it just because he's a bigger guy. He's much more of a heavy hitter. And Ian Pace is much more finesse. I mean, he can hit, you can hear it in the snare, but he's more about dynamics than he is attack. And so a big difference between those two guys. I guess Ian's roadies had to work very, very hard on his kit to restore it to his normal condition. I imagine a lot of parts were replaced. But in any case, we get a lot of really good snare work on this album, and this song is a real highlight for it especially. Okay, so before we get to the next part here, I just thought I'd chime in and talk about Nick Simper's bass. Love the way it sounds. It's more attack than decay. We're not getting a lot of the real low end bass sound. We're just getting really kind of the hit of the string. And it's interesting because it doesn't sound muted. It's not like he's deadening the note. But we're really not getting a lot of ring out on it. But I do love the sound. I love the way his bass sounds on this album. Interestingly, we're not hearing a lot of Richie so far on this side of the album. And it didn't really dawn on me before, other than And the Address, where he was very prominent. This album so far has been a lot of John Lord, a lot more John Lord than anything else. And Richie's just kind of sitting in the back, watching it all develop. And he's definitely playing some good rhythm. He's where he needs to be. He's filling in the song, but he's not really throwing anything in that's signature Richie at this point. But as I've read, and I think I mentioned it in one of the earlier episodes, he was kind of figuring out what they wanted to be and figuring out who he wanted to be as a player. And he certainly had the talent. I mean, all that work he did with Joe Meek, you don't get that without being pretty proven, I would say. But yeah, it is interesting how little of Richie we get on this side of the album. Now, when we get to Mandrake Root, it's going to be a different story. He is all over that song, just like he was And the Address. And we got some of him in Hush, which was nice. But again, that was, big keyboard solo and everything else. So it's just kind of interesting. And this is a little bit more, I would say, classical than rock and roll. So it kind of makes sense that John Lord was probably the writer. I couldn't find definitive credits. What I saw mostly was, if you know anything about this song, please let us know. Then here's the official credit. So I don't want to speak on behalf of who actually wrote it, but I would say it's very likely that it was John Lord, because it is so keyboard heavy and so classical. But let's get back to the song, because we've got a good build going here. I'm getting the same sound out of the guitar that I am out of the bass, where I'm just getting a lot of, tinny and attack, and not a real rich, full sound. It does seem very, very dry and thin. But Richie picked up the playing here a little bit as this part plays along with John. And it's just got an intensity to it that I really dig. And I've always enjoyed this. As a drummer, of course, I mean, the snare work is what is of greatest interest to me. And I remember sitting down with my drum pad and learning every note of this, everything that Ian played. Of course, I couldn't get the accents quite right because I didn't have quite the control over the sticks that I would develop later in years. But as a very young drummer, was just fascinated by the song. And I remember one New Year's Eve, my brother and I were staying with my grandparents, as we would usually stay with them for a few days over winter break. And my grandfather had us bring our instruments. So I brought my pieced together drum set that I had at the time. And my brother had his guitar. And it was a neat guitar. I think it was, I want to say it was a Sears guitar, but it had pedal buttons in the guitar. So you would just like press a button and you'd get tremolo, and you'd press a button and you'd get distortion. You didn't have a whole lot of control over it, but you didn't have to buy external pedals. Funny enough, it was a big red guitar that looked very similar to the, what was it, an ES 335, I think, that Richie was playing on this album. And then he would go on, my brother would also go on to get a Blonde Strat, basically inspired by Richie. But the cool thing was that you had all the effects in there. So you really had everything at your hands. And that sounded a lot better than this. And part of it could have been the recording. I mean, they set it up quick. I don't know how much they did in way of sound checks. Obviously, Richie was good at getting tone at the time from all the studio recordings he did. I'm sure he learned tons from Joe. I'm sure that Joe Meek, I'm sure that he experimented a lot on his own. But what we get on this album is a very thin sounding guitar on some of these songs, especially where he's just kind of laying back, playing more rhythm. So even with him playing along with John, we're not getting guitar tone as much as we are just the crunchiness of him hitting the strings. So it's interesting because it's not what we'll really ever hear from Richie again after this era. See, and you can hear a little sound just before the note, and I don't know if that's Richie. It kind of sounds like it might be coming from the guitar. It feels like it's in the left ear a little bit more than my right, and that's where the guitar's been sitting. So it does sound like it could be coming from him. I don't think it's Nick because we're hearing the bass come through okay. But here is where it's kind of transferring into I'm So Glad territory as we're getting into that riff. But yeah, I really dig that. I love that they went back to the rhythm. I like that they just let it go flat and just have that pulse before they start in on the next song. And I think that's a great way to do a transition. Sometimes it's cool to just have a riff or a transitional part that's maybe a little bit technical and have that be the build to go into the song. But it's really cool when you just lay back and go, okay, here's what we've done now. We're going to give you a little lull and get ready for the next thing. And they do it with just perfection on this, as far as I'm concerned. But I think the real star on this one, honestly, I mean, John's up there, but I think the real star has got to be Ian Pace on this. That snare work is pretty fantastic. And, you know, drummers back in this time, I mean, they really knew their rudiments. They knew how to really work a snare because that was the center of the kit. Nowadays, and the way that I always preferred to play is I liked having a lot of toms because I like to play melodic. So I like to have a lot of choices for colors and tone. And so I like to have, 6 rack toms and 1 or 2 floor toms. This is really 1 rack tom. I know he had 1 floor tom. He may have had 2 at this point. I'm not sure if he added it here or if he added it on Book of Taliesin or for Deep Purple, but it was a very basic kit. So the snare is really going to be the center of that, really working the snare. And drummers were not doing a huge amount of, at least in rock and roll, they weren't really doing a lot of hi-hat dynamics yet. So really, everything came through on the snare. And I think this was honestly, like I said, just a masterclass in stick control, in performance, in creativity, in flow. All those things are present in the snare work on this song. And I absolutely love it. I think he did such a great job. So I don't know. Hope you guys like it. It's a great song. I know a lot of people are kind of down on Mark 1. They're like, oh, that was before Mark 2. That was before they became really heavy and all that. But I'm telling you, there are a lot of great songs on these albums. You have to step away from the production, I think, a little bit. And yes, it is part of our experience. It is part of what makes the song what we hear and whether we'll enjoy it or not. Because if you have bad production, it is hard to enjoy a song. But if you can get past that and you can really just listen to what they're playing, it's pretty fantastic. And again, trying to step into 1968 and imagine you're hearing this album for the first time. This is your introduction to this band. I would find it hard pressed. Anybody who's interested in, pop or rock music of the day wouldn't have started listening to this album and gone, these guys are doing something interesting and different. I want more. I want to know what they're about. I would have a hard time, but then there's the political side of, well, if you're a British band, you can't do this, you can't do that, and all that sort of thing. And I get that. Then you've also got, the generational gap of people who maybe were just shy of appreciating the Beatles or just shy of appreciating the newer Beatles. And they want more straightforward stuff. Not going to get that with Deep Purple. I mean, there's a time where they're a little more commercial, but really they're kind of a combination between that. We know how to do that stuff, but we're also going to embellish it. We can be progressive, and you're going to see some elements of that, but we're not really a progressive band either, just kind of somewhere in the middle. And when I just sit back and just listen to the music, at the end of the day, this song, it just makes me happy. And I mean, obviously, title-wise, that's the point. It sets that expectation, I think. But if it wasn't for the snare, I don't know how much we'd have to work with. So I'm going to say the snare is really the star of the song. The rest is there. You've got to have the support, and they do a great job with that. But snare all the way for me on this one. But it's a song I love. I'm always happy to play it. And whenever I do play Shades of Deep Purple, it's one that I just smile when it starts up because I know I'm in for some good stuff. So that is our episode today. See you guys, I guess maybe in a few minutes or in an hour or whenever you want to listen to the next episode, our 5th and final episode of Launch Day. Have a great one, guys. Cheers. Thanks for listening to Deep Purple Smoke on the Podcast, a tour of the entire Deep Purple studio recordings. Please remember to give the show a rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Leave a comment and tell your friends. I also have a Patreon set up if you'd like to support the show. You can also write to me at smokeonthepodcast@gmail.com. I hope you enjoyed the episode and thanks for listening.